Before Rowan reached her, Isolde had already lived through 20 minutes that seemed longer than the 6 years of their marriage. She had stood among strangers who believed they knew her because they knew the cut of her gowns, the rank of her husband, and the number of dinners she gave each season. None of them knew that she had once waited outside Rowan's study with a tray growing cold because she heard him laughing inside and could not remember the last time he had laughed with her. None knew that she had spent the previous winter explaining his absences to his mother, smoothing over missed engagements, and telling herself that loyalty was not foolish simply because it was lonely. Lady Sutherfield, the hostess, had approached her after the conservatory door closed. She asked whether Isolde felt faint. Isolde had answered that the room was warm. The lie came easily, which frightened her more than the discovery itself. She had become so practiced at protecting Rowan that even with the evidence of his betrayal still before her eyes, her first instinct was to protect him from consequence. Across the ballroom, Odette had emerged several minutes later. Her cheeks were bright, her composure imperfect. She had looked directly at Isolde and then away. In that brief failure of courage, Isolde understood that this was not rumor, flirtation, or a moment that could be explained by poor light. Odette knew herself to be guilty. Rowan knew himself to be guilty. Only Isolde had been expected to continue behaving as though guilt belonged to no one. She remembered Nan's warning among the autumn roses and the letter found beneath Rowan's desk. She remembered returning it exactly where it had lain, because some last frightened part of her hoped he might confess without being forced. He never did. Instead, he had dressed for the ball, asked whether the silver gown was new, and remarked that she ought to smile more because people had begun to call her severe. So she had smiled. She had smiled while fastening his cufflink when his fingers fumbled. She had smiled in the carriage while he stared out the window. She had smiled when Lady Sutherfield welcomed them as the most elegant couple in the room. That smile had been the final service of the perfect wife he believed he possessed. When he finally crossed the ballroom toward her, anger already arranged on his face, Isolde felt the last of her fear leave. She saw with almost painful clarity that he had mistaken her silence for consent, her patience for blindness, and her love for a resource that would renew itself no matter how carelessly he spent it. The realization did not make her hate him. Hatred would have been warmer. It simply made her tired. Outside, beyond the windows, a thin frost silvered the garden. The carriage lamps waited in a row at the curb, each one a small, steady flame in the dark. Isolde looked toward them and understood that leaving would not be dramatic once the doors closed behind her. It would be cold, inconvenient, and uncertain. She did not know where she would sleep. She did not know whether society would pity her, condemn her, or turn her into a cautionary tale. She knew only that uncertainty had become less frightening than another evening beside a man who required her to doubt herself so he could remain comfortable. That knowledge held her upright when Rowan's fingers closed around her elbow. It carried her into the alcove, and when he told her what she had been supposed to be, it gave her the answer she had postponed for years. The candlelight in the Larchmere ballroom was the color of honey, and it fell across Isolde Ashworth's shoulders as though it loved her, though nothing else in that room did any more. She stood near the tall windows in a gown of pale silver silk, her gloved hands folded, her spine straight, the picture of a duchess who had learned over 6 years of marriage exactly how to hold herself so that no one could see what was breaking inside her. She had seen it only 20 minutes before. Through the gap in the conservatory doors where the orchids grew thick and the air smelled of green things and secrets, she had seen her husband's hand resting at the small of Lady Odette Vane's back, and she had seen Odette's head tip toward his shoulder the way a woman's head tips only for a man she has touched before. Isolde had not screamed. She had not wept. She had simply closed the door again, gently, so the hinges would not creak, and walked back into the golden light of the ballroom as though her whole life had not just folded in on itself like a paper house in the rain. Now, Rowan Ashworth, Duke of Everholt, crossed the floor toward her, his jaw tight, his eyes carrying the particular anger of a guilty man who has decided somewhere in the last 20 minutes that the safest place to stand is on the attack. He did not know she had seen. He only knew that Odette had warned him, breathless, that the Duchess had been near the conservatory, that she had asked one of the footmen too many questions about where his grace had gone. "A word, Isolde," he said low, and took her elbow, steering her toward the alcove behind the string quartet where the music would swallow their voices. His grip was not gentle. It had not been gentle in a long while. She let him lead her because 6 years of marriage had taught her that resistance in public cost more than it purchased. In the alcove, half hidden by a column wound with ivy, he turned on her, and for one strange moment she saw not a duke, but a boy who had been caught, dressing his fear as fury. "You were asking the staff where I'd gone," he said, "in front of half of London's gossips. Do you understand what that looks like?" "I was looking for my husband," she said quietly. "At a ball. I did not realize that required an apology." "It requires discretion." His voice dropped, sharp as a blade drawn slow from its sheath. "You embarrass me, Isolde. You always have. I gave you a title, a house, a name older than the crown itself, and still you managed to make yourself a spectacle." He glanced past her, to where a cluster of matrons had turned, sensing blood in the water the way matrons always did. He lowered his voice further, but not far enough. "You were supposed to be a perfect wife." The words landed in her like a stone dropped into still water, and for one terrible second the whole ballroom seemed to ripple outward from the place they had struck. She looked at him, really looked, the way she had not let herself look in months, because looking too closely at a thing you love that is dying is its own kind of cruelty. She saw the champagne flush high on his cheeks. She saw, faint as a shadow, a smear of pale powder on the dark wool of his shoulder, the same shade Odette Vane wore. She saw a man who had built his whole life on being admired and had never once learned how to be ashamed in front of her, only annoyed by the inconvenience of almost being caught. "A perfect wife," Isolde repeated, and something in her voice made him blink, made the nearest matrons go very still with their fans half raised. "Yes, I remember promising that, Rowan. I don't recall you promising anything at all." "Don't," he said, and there was warning in it now. "I gave you 6 years, she said, and her voice did not shake, though her heart was breaking so loudly she was certain the musicians could hear it over their violins. "I gave you my father's name and my mother's peace of mind, and every quiet, unglamorous hour I spent learning your tenants' names and your mother's recipes and the particular way you like your tea when your head aches. I was patient when you were cold. I was patient when you were absent. I have been patient, your grace, for so long that I nearly forgot I was allowed to stop. Isolde, you want to know what a perfect wife would have done tonight?" She smiled then, and it was the smile that would be spoken of in drawing rooms for months afterward, a smile with no anger in it at all, only a terrible, luminous calm, like a woman setting down a weight she has carried so long her arms have forgotten how light she is without it. She would have stayed silent. She would have swallowed it, the way she has swallowed everything else, and gone home beside you in the carriage, and lain awake counting the ways she had failed to be enough. But I find, my lord, that I am not perfect after all. She stepped back from him, out of the alcove, into the candlelight, where every eye in the room that had been pretending not to watch now openly did. "Thank you for a lovely evening," she said, to him, to the room, to no one at all, and she inclined her head with the exact, precise grace of a duchess, taking her leave of a party that had grown tiresome. Then Isolde Ashworth turned and walked the length of the Larchmere ballroom alone, past the orchestra, past the astonished hostess, past Lady Odette Vane standing frozen by the conservatory doors, with her hands still pressed flat against her own throat, and out into the cold, star-scattered dark, leaving the Duke of Everholt standing beneath the honeyed candlelight, with every eye in London's finest ballroom fixed upon him, and no wife left to blame. 6 years before that night, Isolde Farrow had been 20 years old and entirely unremarkable, by the cruel arithmetic of her world. She was not the prettiest of her sisters, nor the wittiest, nor the one whose laugh made men forget their manners across a crowded room. She was the quiet one, the one who noticed things. Which servant was overworked, which guest was lonely, which ledger did not balance though everyone insisted it must. Her father called her his clever girl, in the tone men use for a compliment that is also, faintly, an apology. Bramblewick, the Farrow family home, sat on land that had once been rich, and was, by the year Isolde turned 20, mortgaged so thoroughly that her father flinched at the sound of the post arriving. Sir Edmund Farrow was a kind man and a poor manager of money, and by the time Isolde understood the shape of their ruin, there was very little left to be done about it, except find a way to save what remained of her family's name. The offer, when it came, arrived through her aunt, who knew a woman, who knew the Duke of Everholt's solicitor. The Duke required a wife, not a romance. He was plain about that from the very first meeting, sitting stiff and unsmiling in her father's drawing room while rain streaked the windows. But a woman capable of managing a great house, bearing an heir, and asking no inconvenient questions about where his affections had settled before her arrival. In exchange, her father's debts would vanish as though they had never existed, and her mother would never again have to pretend at dinner parties that everything was well. "You understand," Rowan had said to her that first afternoon, his grey eyes steady and entirely without warmth, "that I do not offer you love. I offer you a position of considerable consequence, security for your family, and my respect, so long as you conduct yourself with discretion. I think you are sensible enough to know the difference between a fairy tale and a fair bargain." Isolde had studied him for a long moment before answering. He was handsome in the way that certain marble statues are handsome, impressive, cold, built for admiration rather than touching. But beneath the practiced boredom in his face, she thought she saw something else, a tightness around his eyes. A man guarding a wound he did not intend to name. "I understand perfectly," she had said. "And I accept, Your Grace, not because I dream of being a duchess, but because I believe a fair bargain, honestly kept, can be its own kind of good life." She had meant it. That was the part that would ache most later, remembering it, how completely she had meant it, and how carefully, foolishly, she had let herself begin to hope for something more than a bargain after all. The wedding had been grand and cold, held in the ancient chapel at Everholt Hall, attended by 300 guests who murmured about the sensible match and the plain girl who had done well for herself. Isolde had worn her mother's pearls and her grandmother's courage and had not cried, not once, though her new husband had not looked at her for longer than duty required during the entire ceremony. The negotiations lasted 3 weeks. Men discussed Isolde's future in rooms where she was sometimes present and often not. Her father's solicitor spoke of settlements, annuities, and protections for younger sisters. Rowan's man spoke of heirs, discretion, and the maintenance of Everholt's dignity. Isolde listened from the end of the table and learned how thoroughly a woman's life could be translated into clauses. Her mother wept in private and praised the match in public. Sir Edmund apologized only once. He found Isolde in the morning room with household bills spread before her and stood by the window, twisting his signet ring. "I should have protected you from this choice," he said. "You protected us from many things," Isolde replied. "You simply could not protect us from arithmetic." He looked older then, not because his hair had changed, but because she had ceased seeing him only as her father. He was a gentleman who had believed gentleness could compensate for carelessness. It could not. His failures had created the bargain, but his shame could not undo it. Rowan visited Bramblewick twice more before the wedding. On the second visit, Isolde led him through the kitchen garden, because the drawing room had become crowded with relatives eager to study the future Duke and Duchess. Rain had softened the paths. Rowan kept his polished boots carefully away from the mud. "You need not pretend enthusiasm," he told her. "I was not aware I was pretending it." "You are very calm for a woman preparing to marry a stranger. And you are very suspicious of calm for a man who claims to desire it." For the first time, one corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it altered his face enough to make him seem younger. He asked what she had been reading. She told him about an agricultural report on crop rotation. He looked genuinely surprised. "My steward handles such matters." "Then your steward is fortunate. At Bramblewick, necessity has made scholars of us all." They passed the beehives, where Isolde stopped to speak with the gardener about winter coverings. Rowan watched her ask 3 precise questions and remember each answer. She felt his assessment shift. Until then, he had regarded her as a solution selected by solicitors. In the garden, he began to see the particular shape of the usefulness he was purchasing. That should have offended her. Instead, she found herself wanting him to see more. On his final visit, he brought her a book of poems. It arrived without inscription, wrapped in plain paper, and he presented it with visible discomfort. "You mentioned the author," he said. "I happened to see it." Isolde understood that men like Rowan often hid tenderness behind accident. She thanked him without making the gift heavier than he could bear. That evening she read until the candles burned low, and for the first time allowed herself to imagine that respect might become companionship. Her aunt warned her against hope. A practical marriage is safest when both parties remain practical. But hope did not arrive as a grand illusion. It entered through small doors, a nearly hidden smile in a wet garden, a remembered author, the way Rowan had listened when she spoke of tenant farms. Isolde did not dream that he would become a different man. She dreamed only that the man already there might one day turn fully toward her. The morning of the wedding, her mother fastened the family pearls around her throat. They were not especially valuable, but every Pharaoh bride had worn them for 4 generations. "A wife must sometimes bend," her mother whispered. "But do not bend so often that you forget your original shape." Isolde promised she would remember. Years later she would think of that promise and understand that forgetting oneself rarely happens in a single surrender. It happens by degrees, each concession small enough to seem loving. Everholt Hall did not welcome Isolde so much as test her. The house contained 112 rooms, 47 servants, 3 generations of resentments, and a dowager duchess who believed competence was proven only after surviving criticism. During Isolde's first week, the kitchen served meals timed according to the late Duke's habits. The housekeeper distrusted every alteration, and Rowan disappeared into estate business before breakfast. Isolde began where she always began, by noticing. The scullery maid with cracked hands was being given lye too strong for washing. The linen inventory had not been updated in 4 years. 2 tenant petitions had remained unopened beneath a stack of invitations. Rowan's mother complained that the blue drawing room was always cold, though the western flue had been blocked since spring. Isolde corrected none of these things publicly. She asked questions, learned loyalties, and made changes small enough that people could accept them without feeling conquered. Within 3 months, meals arrived hot, accounts balanced, and the Dowager Duchess stopped calling her the Pharaoh Girl. Within 6, the servants had begun coming to her before they went to the steward. Rowan noticed results before he noticed the labor that produced them. One evening, he found Isolde at the library table surrounded by estate maps. "What are you doing?" "Preventing the north cottages from flooding again." He frowned. "That is Calder's responsibility." "Calder believes the river is to blame. Rivers are rarely persuaded by blame." She showed him where an old drainage channel had been filled during his father's improvements. Rowan leaned over the map, his shoulder nearly touching hers. They argued for half an hour. The next morning he rode out with the steward and returned muddy, thoughtful, and unwilling to admit she had been right. "The channel will be reopened," he said at dinner. "An excellent idea." His eyes narrowed. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. That laugh became one of the small treasures of their early marriage. Others followed. He began bringing correspondence to her, at first under the pretense that he wanted a second opinion on grammar, later because he trusted her judgment. She learned that his coldness was not emptiness, but defense. His father had praised achievement and mocked need. His mother loved him fiercely but required him to perform strength. Odette's abandonment, though forced by her family, had confirmed the lesson he already believed. Affection could be withdrawn the moment something more advantageous appeared. Isolde never asked him to speak of it directly, she simply made room. When his old hound died, Rowan sat beside the animal's empty basket long after the servants had carried the body away. Isolde joined him on the floor, her skirts spread over the carpet. They remained there until dawn touched the windows. Afterward he said, "You never demand anything." She mistook it for gratitude. In truth, it was both praise and warning. Rowan found safety in a wife who understood him without requiring that he understand her in return. Isolde told herself reciprocity would come with time. She did not yet see how easily generosity, when given without limit, teaches another person to expect abundance without stewardship. There were happy seasons. She would never deny them merely because later pain had altered their meaning. They rode together at Everholt in spring. He read poetry aloud during a storm when the roads made travel impossible. Once, after she solved a dispute between two tenant families, he kissed her forehead in the corridor and called her "my clever Duchess." She carried the warmth of it for weeks. Their marriage became intimate by increments. He began sleeping in her rooms not only from obligation, but because he liked waking beside her. She learned the scar along his ribs from a riding fall at 17. He learned that she hated thunder, but loved the first rain after a dry summer. Yet even in tenderness, Rowan kept a chamber of himself locked. Isolde sensed it and waited outside, believing patience would one day be rewarded with a key. They had no child. At first, this was a disappointment shared quietly. Later, it became a subject Rowan avoided and his mother treated with strained courtesy. Isolde endured physicians, tonics, and whispered speculation. Rowan never blamed her aloud, but he also never stood beside her when others did. Each silence placed a small stone between them. By their 4th anniversary, the household regarded them as settled and fortunate. Isolde believed it too. She had built a life from small Tuesdays, and because she had built it carefully, she thought it could not easily fall. She did not yet know that houses are most vulnerable where their owners refuse to inspect the foundation. But marriage, she discovered in the months that followed, was not made only of grand ceremonies. It was made of small, unglamorous Tuesdays, of learning that Rowan took his tea black and bitter after a bad meeting with his steward, of discovering he read poetry alone in the library at night, though he would have denied it to his own reflection, of the evening she found him sitting with his childhood dog, now old and dying, and stayed silent beside him for 2 hours because she understood, without being told, that he did not want comfort so much as company that asked for nothing. Slowly, without permission from either of them, something had begun to grow between the bargain's two halves. He began seeking her out at breakfast instead of eating alone. He began once, twice, then often, to ask her opinion on matters of the estate and to actually listen to her answer. And Isolde, careful, clever Isolde, who had promised herself she would never be foolish enough to want more than the bargain offered, had fallen in love with her husband anyway, quietly, the way a house settles into its foundation, so gradually she did not notice it happening until it was simply, permanently true. She did not tell him. She did not need to. She believed in those early years that he could see it in the way she smiled when he entered a room, in the way she remembered every small preference of his without being asked. She believed foolishly that love shown was love enough, and that in time he would come to feel the same steady warmth toward her that she felt toward him. For a while it seemed as though he might. His name for Isolde had softened in those middle years, from Duchess to Isolde to, rarely, tenderly, my dear, and she had treasured each small escalation like a woman collecting pearls one at a time onto a string. She had believed, she would think later, with the particular bitterness of hindsight, that they were building something real, that the bargain had transformed, the way iron transforms under enough patient heat, into something with an entirely different nature. It was in the 4th year that Lady Odette Vane returned to London. Isolde heard the name before she ever saw the face, whispered behind fans at a card party, accompanied by knowing glances in her direction that she pretended not to notice. Lady Odette, recently widowed, exquisitely beautiful, had once, before Isolde, before Bramblewick's debts, before any bargain had ever been struck, been Rowan's great love. They had been engaged briefly in his 22nd year, before her family had forced her into a wealthier match with a viscount 3 times her age. Rowan, it was said, had never quite recovered. Isolde had asked him about it once, gently, over dinner, in the careful voice of a wife who wants honesty more than comfort. Rowan had gone very still, his fork motionless above his plate. "That was a long time ago," he had said. "It has nothing to do with us." She had believed him. That was the cruelty of it, looking back. How completely, how willingly she had believed him, because believing him was so much easier than doubting the foundation she had built her whole heart upon. But belief, she was learning now, cannot survive forever on nothing but hope. Odette Vane began appearing everywhere Rowan did, at the opera, at his club's charity ball, at the horse races where Isolde herself rarely attended, preferring the quiet of the estate to the noise of the city. Rowan grew, by careful degrees so small she nearly convinced herself she was imagining them, more distant. He came to bed later. He answered her questions about his days with fewer words. He began, for the first time in 3 years, to forget the small things, how she took her coffee, which of his letters she had asked after, the anniversary of the day they had first truly spoken as something other than strangers bound by a contract. "You seem tired lately," she said to him one evening, watching him rub his temples over a letter he did not let her see. "Business," he said, and did not look up. She wanted so badly to ask him plainly, "Is it her?" But some frightened, self-protective part of her understood that asking the question aloud would make its answer permanent in a way that silence, however painful, still allowed her to survive. So she did not ask. She poured his tea the way he liked it, black and bitter, and set it beside his elbow, and told herself that a good wife trusted her husband, and that trust offered generously enough might yet be repaid. It was Nan Pruitt, her old nurse from Bramblewick, now housekeeper at Everholt Hall, who finally said the thing no one else dared to. "Your Grace," Nan said one grey afternoon, finding Isolde alone in the west garden, her hands full of the last cut roses of autumn. "I have served this family since before you were born into your own. I loved you as a girl, and I love you now as a woman grown, and it is out of that love, not disrespect, that I must tell you. The staff are talking. About the letters his Grace receives and burns before anyone can read them. About the perfume on his coat that is not yours. I would rather you hear it from a woman who loves you than from a stranger's cruel mouth at some ball." Isolde had stood very still among the roses, a single thorn pressing into her thumb through her glove, and had felt something inside her, some last stubborn architecture of hope, begin, quietly, irreversibly, to crack. "Thank you, Nan," she had said finally, her voice steady though her hands were not. "I believe I have known for some time. I simply was not ready to know it out loud." Odette's return changed London before it changed Everholt. Invitations multiplied. Old stories resurfaced in drawing rooms. Women who had once pitied Rowan for losing the great love of his youth now watched Isolde with sharpened curiosity, as though a legal wife were merely the interval between a romantic beginning and its proper conclusion. Isolde met Odette at Lady Marbury's musicale. The widow wore violet silk and carried grief beautifully. She approached Isolde with both hands extended. "Your Grace, at last. I have heard so much of your kindness." The sentence was flawless and somehow insulting. Isolde accepted her hands. Odette's fingers were cool. "And I have heard much of your travels," Isolde replied. For several minutes they spoke of Italy, music, and the inconvenience of English weather. Rowan stood across the room, pretending not to watch. When Odette laughed, his face altered before he could stop it. Isolde saw recognition there, not merely of beauty, but of a self he had once been. On the carriage ride home, she asked whether he had enjoyed the evening. It was tolerable. "Lady Odette seems well." His shoulders tightened. "Must we discuss her?" "No. I thought perhaps you wished to." "I do not." The refusal might have ended the matter had it not been followed by so many coincidences. Odette joined the same charitable committee Rowan advised. She attended a house party where he had gone to discuss horses. Her carriage was seen outside his club on an afternoon when ladies were not usually admitted. Each event could be explained. Together they formed a pattern Isolde was expected not to recognize. Rowan's distance came in ordinary disguises. He was tired. Parliament ran late. The roads were poor. A friend required counsel. Isolde answered every excuse with grace, but grace began to feel like participation in her own deception. One winter night he returned after 2 a.m. Snow powdered his shoulders. Isolde was waiting in the library with a book open and unread. "You should be asleep," he said. "So should you." He removed his gloves. Lavender and orange blossom moved faintly through the room. "Were you with her?" Isolde asked. The question finally escaped, quieter than she had imagined. Rowan looked at her for a long moment. "Do not become suspicious, Isolde. It does not suit you." He walked past before she could answer. The cruelty lay not only in the evasion, but in his attempt to make perception a flaw in her character. She sat alone until the fire died, wondering when the man who once valued her attention had begun resenting it. Nan saw more because servants always do. She noticed the stable boy instructed to keep a grey mare ready on Tuesdays. She found a handkerchief embroidered with an O beneath the seat of Rowan's carriage. She said nothing until silence became, in her judgment, a greater betrayal than speech. After their conversation in the rose garden, Isolde pricked her thumb on a thorn. A bead of blood spread beneath the pale leather of her glove. She stared at it with strange fascination. Pain, when visible, was simpler. One could identify its source and bind the wound. That evening she dined opposite Rowan beneath portraits of his ancestors. He spoke about drainage rents and a new roof for the West Granary. Isolde answered intelligently. No one observing them would have guessed that the marriage had shifted. Perhaps, she thought, this was how great houses survived scandal. Not because their inhabitants were happy, but because silver continued to shine and soup continued to arrive at the correct temperature. After dinner, Rowan paused beside her chair. For one breath, hope rose foolishly. He touched her shoulder. "You are pale. Are you unwell?" She looked up at him and wondered whether concern and betrayal could occupy the same heart without destroying each other. "Only tired," she said. He accepted the answer with relief. That relief was its own confession. There's a particular kind of grief in searching for evidence of a betrayal you already believe in your bones to be true. A grief made of hope, fighting a losing war against certainty, one small defeat at a time. Isolde told herself in the weeks that followed her conversation with Nan that she was not spying. She told herself she was simply, finally, paying attention, the way she had once paid attention to every detail of a man she loved, only now turning that same careful eye toward the wound instead of away from it. She began to notice what she had trained herself for 2 years not to see. The way Rowan's study door was locked now, where once it had stood open to her freely. The particular days he rode out alone, always Tuesdays, always returning, smelling faintly of lavender and orange blossom, a scent Isolde herself never wore. The letters that arrived addressed only to him, in a looping, confident hand, which he read standing by the fire, and then fed, one by one, into the flames. She found the first true proof by accident, or so she told herself, though some honest part of her admitted she had been looking for a reason to enter his study for weeks. A single letter, fallen behind the leg of his writing desk, missed by a hand usually so careful. She should not have read it. She read it anyway, standing in the grey afternoon light with her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. "My darling Rowan," it began in that same confident hand, "I grow tired of stolen Tuesdays. You were mine before you were ever hers, and a paper marriage cannot undo what we always were to each other. Come to me on Thursday, when she takes her mother to the country. I will be waiting, as I have always been waiting, for the man who was never meant to belong to anyone but me. Ever yours, O." Isolde stood holding the letter for a long time, long enough for the fire to die down to embers, long enough for the light in the window to shift from grey to the deeper grey of coming evening. She did not cry. She would think, later, that this was the strangest part of that whole terrible year. How rarely she cried, how the grief seemed to settle instead into something colder and stiller, a lake freezing over from the surface down. She thought of her wedding day, and the vow she had made in that cold chapel, meaning every word though he had not looked at her while she said it. She thought of the 2 hours beside his dying dog, the poetry she had pretended not to notice him reading, the black bitter tea she had poured 1,000 times with her own 2 hands, believing each cup was a small, quiet proof of love. She thought of every ordinary Tuesday she had spent building a life inside a bargain that, she now understood with terrible clarity, had never once stopped being only a bargain to him. She folded the letter along its original creases, precise as a woman closing a wound before it can be seen, and placed it exactly where she had found it, behind the desk leg, as though she had never touched it at all. Then Isolde Ashworth walked to her own chamber, sat before her mirror, and studied her reflection for a long, unflinching hour. The pale, composed face of a duchess who had spent 6 years learning to be perfect for a man who had never once intended to be faithful to her in return. "You will not break me," she told the woman in the glass, and did not yet know if she believed it. "Not tonight, not ever again." It was 3 weeks later that Lady Sutherfield's ball arrived on the calendar, the grandest event of the autumn season, and Isolde dressed for it that evening in pale silver silk, not because she wished to please her husband, but because she had decided, quietly and finally, that she would not give the gossiping rooms of London the satisfaction of seeing her diminished. She would go to that ball as a duchess, whole and undiminished, and whatever happened there, she would meet it standing upright. She did not yet know it would be the night everything broke open in front of the entire world. But some small, wise part of her, the part that had always noticed things others missed, dressed that evening as though preparing for battle, and was not wrong to do so. The letter did not merely confirm an affair. It revealed the story Rowan and Odette told themselves in order to make betrayal feel noble. In Odette's hand, their marriage became paper. Isolde became an interruption, and stolen Tuesdays became evidence of a love too great for ordinary morality. There was no mention of the woman who had kept Everholt through illness, debt, bad harvests, and 6 years of daily devotion. Erasure, Isolde discovered, was sometimes more painful than hatred. She replaced the letter and left the study exactly as she found it. In the corridor, a footman asked whether she wished the lamps lit. Isolde answered calmly. She walked to her own room, dismissed her maid, and sat before the mirror without removing her gloves. For years she had believed the face reflected there was insufficiently beautiful to secure Rowan's whole heart. Now she studied it with new severity. The fault was not in the shape of her mouth or the quiet color of her eyes. Beauty had not caused the betrayal. Entitlement had. Rowan had accepted her love as part of the estate, something conveyed with the marriage settlement and therefore not requiring protection. The next weeks were marked by an unnatural peace. Isolde no longer searched for evidence because certainty had ended the search. Instead, she began to observe the architecture of her life. Which accounts bore only her handwriting? Which charities relied on her? Which friendships belonged to her rather than to the Duchess? How much money could she legally command without Rowan's permission? The questions frightened her, but they also created a narrow path through the fog. She visited her solicitor under the pretense of revising a charitable trust. Mr. Vale was an elderly man with kind eyes and an instinct for discretion. Isolde asked what rights a wife possessed if she wished to live separately. He removed his spectacles. "May I ask whether this is theoretical?" "You may ask." He waited. She did not answer. The law offered less freedom than dignity required. Her income was protected by settlement, but property and reputation remained tangled with Rowan's. Formal separation would invite scrutiny. Divorce was nearly impossible without a public spectacle designed to humiliate her as thoroughly as him. "Then I shall not begin with law," Isolde said. "I shall begin with a door." Mr. Vale did not understand, but Nan would later. Leaving first was a fact. Explanations could follow. Still, Isolde gave Rowan opportunities to tell the truth. She mentioned Thursday's journey to her mother's country house and watched him hide his relief. She asked whether he would accompany her. He claimed an estate meeting. On Thursday morning, she departed in one carriage, doubled back at the next village, and returned by the servants' road. From the upper gallery, she saw him cross the entrance hall dressed not for business, but for pleasure. He carried no papers. A sprig of winter jasmine, Odette's favorite flower, was tucked into his buttonhole. Isolde did not confront him. The sight produced no new wound, only the dull finality of a verdict already delivered. She spent the afternoon in the old schoolroom, a chamber unused since Rowan's childhood. Dust covered the globe. His boyhood initials were cut into the window frame. Here, surrounded by evidence that he had once been young and frightened, she allowed herself to mourn not only the husband he had become, but the man she had believed he might choose to be. Nan found her at dusk. "You need not decide everything tonight," the older woman said. "I decided years ago, every time I stayed." "No. Staying because you hope is not the same as choosing to remain after hope is gone." Isolde turned toward the darkening window. "What would you do?" Nan's face softened. "I would remember that vows are promises between two souls, not chains fastened by one while the other walks free." The answer remained with Isolde. She did not yet know when she would leave. She knew only that the decision, when it came, would not be an act of temper. It would be the last honest thing left in a marriage built increasingly on silence. After Isolde walked out of the ballroom, the story divided into versions. Lady Sutherfield claimed the Duchess had been magnificent. Two matrons insisted she had always been unstable. A young viscount declared Rowan a fool, then apologized when Rowan looked at him. Odette left through the conservatory before the first carriage was called. Rowan remained beneath the chandeliers for less than a minute, though it felt like an hour. He had spent his life believing rank could control a room. That night, rank only ensured everyone witnessed his humiliation with exquisite attention. He found Isolde's cloak gone and her carriage already turning from the square. His first feeling was anger. She had embarrassed him. She had made a private matter public. She had spoken as though 6 years of comfort and position counted for nothing. These thoughts came quickly because they were familiar defenses, stones he could stack between himself and shame. Then he saw Odette's powder on his shoulder in the hall mirror. He wiped it away with his glove, but the pale smear spread. At Everholt's London house, Isolde went directly to her rooms. She did not collapse. She instructed her maid to pack one trunk, sent a note to Nan, and asked that the small morning carriage be prepared before dawn. Only after the door closed did she remove her silver gown. The fabric slipped to the carpet like shed skin. Her hands shook so violently she could not unfasten the pearls at her throat. She pulled until the clasp broke. Beads scattered across the floor, rolling beneath furniture and into corners. Isolde knelt among them and began gathering each one. That was how Nan found her, a duchess on the carpet in her shift, collecting pearls with tears finally moving soundlessly down her face. "Leave them," Nan said. "They were my mother's. Then we shall gather them together." They worked on their knees until every visible pearl was recovered. The task steadied Isolde. Grief became a sequence of small actions. Lift, count, breathe, place. By the time the trunk was closed, dawn had lightened the windows. Rowan returned shortly before sunrise. He entered the house expecting confrontation and found quiet. Isolde's room was empty, except for the silver gown folded across a chair and one pearl beneath the dressing table, missed in the darkness. He picked it up. Only then did anger give way to fear. For 3 days he told himself she would return when pride cooled. He sent no apology because apology would imply fault, and fault remained a country he had spent his life avoiding. Instead, he dispatched inquiries disguised as concern. He learned she was at Bramblewick, that Nan was with her, and that she had refused visitors. Meanwhile, the house began revealing her absence. Breakfast arrived with coffee instead of his preferred tea because the new footman had not been told. A delegation of tenants appeared for an appointment Rowan did not remember making. His mother wrote, asking why Isolde had not answered her letter about the Winter Tenants Fund. The household had not ceased functioning, but every mechanism made a small grinding sound. On the 4th day, Rowan entered Isolde's private sitting room. He had rarely done so without invitation. The room was orderly, almost severe. On the desk lay lists in her hand, repairs, pensions, school fees, medicines for 3 cottages, a reminder of his mother's birthday, notes on the dietary needs of a groom recovering from fever. None concerned Isolde herself. He sat in her chair and understood dimly that her love had been expressed in thousands of acts he had mistaken for atmosphere. Odette sent a note that afternoon. She urged him not to surrender to theatrics. Now that truth was exposed, they could begin the life denied them. Rowan read it twice. A month earlier, the words would have thrilled him. Now they seemed strangely thin. Odette spoke of destiny, but not of the tenants waiting in his hall, his mother's loneliness, or the woman gathering broken pearls before dawn. He burned the note. It was not repentance. Not yet. It was only the first crack in the story he had told himself. The days after the ball moved strangely for Isolde, thick and slow as honey, each hour stretching long past its natural length. She had returned to Everholt Hall alone that night, in her own hired carriage rather than her husband's, and had gone directly to her chamber, where she sat by the cold hearth until dawn without once removing her. Silver gown, simply breathing, simply existing inside the enormity of what she had done. By morning, all of London knew. Isolde understood this the way one understands weather. Not because anyone told her directly, but because of the particular hush that fell over the breakfast room when she entered. The way the footman's eyes slid away from hers with a mixture of pity and something that might, astonishingly, have been admiration. Nan brought her chocolate with a steadiness that felt, that morning, like the only solid ground in the world. "They are saying," Nan told her quietly, setting down the tray, "that you smiled at him, Your Grace. That you smiled and thanked him for the evening, and walked out of that ballroom like a queen, leaving a court unworthy of her. Lady Cornelia Wraxham told the greengrocer's wife it was the finest thing she'd witnessed at a ball in 20 years. "I did not smile to be admired," Isolde said, staring into her cup. "I smiled because it was that, or scream, Nan, and screaming would have given him exactly what he wanted, a wife who confirmed in front of the whole room that she was as much a spectacle as he'd accused her of being." Rowan did not return to Everholt Hall that night, nor the next. When he finally did appear, 3 days later, unshaven and hollow-eyed in a way that might once have moved her to tenderness, Isolde received him in the morning room with the same careful composure she had worn at the ball. "Isolde." He stood in the doorway as though uncertain of his welcome, which she supposed distantly he ought to be. "We must talk about what happened." "We must," she agreed, and gestured to the chair across from her, as though he were a caller rather than her husband of 6 years. "Please, sit." He did not sit. He paced instead, running a hand through his dark hair, and she watched him with the strange, detached clarity of a woman observing a stranger. "The things being said about that night, about us, they are damaging. My mother has already written twice. Lady Sutherfield is beside herself that her ball has become the talk of every drawing room in the city for the wrong reasons entirely." "I imagine it is inconvenient," Isolde said, "to be publicly known as an unfaithful husband." He stopped pacing. For a moment something raw crossed his face. Not quite shame, but its nervous cousin, the fear of a man who has always controlled how he is seen and has just discovered he no longer can. "It is not what you think." "Rowan." She said his name gently, and that gentleness seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. "I saw you in the conservatory before you ever said a single cruel word to me at that ball. I have a letter, folded precisely as I found it, behind the leg of your writing desk, addressed to you from a woman who signs herself only O, who calls Thursdays stolen and reminds you that you were hers before you were ever mine. I have known for weeks, my lord. I did not need 3 days of silence to arrive at the truth. I needed 3 days of silence to decide what I intend to do about it." When Rowan arrived at Bramblewick, rain had darkened the stone and turned the drive to mud. He came without servants, an attempt at humility that still carried the privilege of a man certain he would be admitted. Sir Edmund met him in the hall. "My daughter does not wish to see you." "I'm her husband." "Yes," Sir Edmund said. "That appears to be the difficulty." Rowan had never heard the gentleman speak with such coldness. He waited in the library while messages passed upstairs. Bramblewick looked smaller than he remembered, its carpets worn, its windows imperfectly sealed. Yet it possessed a warmth Everholt had lost overnight. Books lay open. A shawl rested carelessly on a chair. Somewhere above, a woman laughed softly, one of Isolde's sisters, perhaps, and Rowan felt excluded from an ordinary intimacy he had once considered beneath notice. When Isolde finally entered, she wore a plain brown dress and no jewels. Without the silver silk and ducal diamonds, she seemed more herself and less accessible. He began badly. "You should not have left without telling me." Her expression did not change. "I told you in a ballroom full of witnesses." "I mean the house." "I had already left the marriage. The house was merely the next door." He had prepared explanations. Odette had been his first love. Old feelings were complicated. He had never intended to humiliate Isolde. Nothing could erase the respect he bore her. Each sentence withered before he spoke it. Respect, he realized, was a poor word to offer a woman one had deceived. "I was a coward," he said at last. It was the first honest sentence. Isolde looked toward the rain-streaked window. "Yes." He told her that Odette had written. He said he had burned the letter. He promised there would be no more meetings. "Do you imagine the problem is that you have not yet performed the correct sacrifice?" she asked. "That if you burn enough letters, dismiss enough servants, or send Odette far enough away, we return to the moment before I knew?" "I imagine nothing. I'm trying to understand what remains possible." "For whom?" The question stopped him. Rowan had thought of saving his marriage, his home, his reputation, perhaps even his better self. He had not asked what possibility would cost Isolde. Returning would require her to live beside the evidence of what he had done, accept apologies she could not test, and resume the labor of believing in him. Once again, she would carry the heavier burden. "I love you," he said. Her face tightened, not with hope, but pain. "You may," she answered, "but love that arrives only when its comfort is withdrawn is difficult to distinguish from hunger." He sat very still. She told him about the letter, the Tuesdays, the jasmine in his coat. She told him of every chance she had offered and every lie he chose. Rowan had believed his secrecy protected her. Hearing the chronology, he understood that secrecy had forced her to experience betrayal alone while continuing to serve him publicly. "I thought if you did not know—" "I knew. I simply did not have your permission to say so." Rain beat harder against the glass. For the first time in his life, Rowan resisted the urge to defend himself. He listened. Isolde's words removed each refuge. Childhood pain did not excuse adult cruelty. Odette's former abandonment did not authorize his present betrayal. An arranged marriage did not make vows optional. Isolde's competence did not make her invulnerable. When she finished, the room felt altered. "What do you need?" he asked. "Distance." "For how long?" "I do not know." Uncertainty frightened him, but he had finally begun to understand that demanding reassurance would be another form of taking. He stood. At the door, he placed the recovered pearl on the table beside her. "I found this in your room." Isolde picked it up after he left. It lay in her palm, small and imperfectly round. She did not mistake its return for a promise. Still, she closed her fingers around it and wept. Not because he had come, but because she knew she would not follow. Something shifted in Rowan's face at the mention of the letter. Not surprise exactly, but the particular collapse of a man who has been maintaining a performance and has just realized his audience saw through it from the very first act. He sank, finally, into the chair across from her, all the fight gone out of his shoulders at once. "I never meant for it to happen the way it did," he said, and his voice had lost its earlier sharpness, gone instead low and almost young, the voice she imagined he must have had at 22, before duty and title had hardened him into the man who stood coldly in her father's drawing room all those years ago. "Odette and I, we were promised to each other once, before her family sold her to Lord Vane like cattle at market. I told myself I had buried it. I told myself our marriage, yours and mine, had become something real." "It had," Isolde said, and her voice broke finally on the words, the first crack in 6 years of careful composure. "It was real, Rowan. To me, it was the realest thing I'd ever built. I loved you. Not the bargain. You. The way you drink your tea black because your father used to mock you for taking sugar as a boy, though you never told me that story. I simply noticed and never asked, because I understood you didn't want it spoken of. The way you sat with your dying dog for 2 hours and let me sit beside you, though you never once looked at me. I built a whole life out of watching you closely enough to love the true shape of you, and you spent that same 6 years keeping half your heart locked in a drawer for a woman who calls our marriage a piece of paper." He flinched visibly as though she had struck him. "Isolde!" "I'm not finished." She stood, and though her hands trembled, her voice did not. "You stood in front of half of London and told me I was supposed to be a perfect wife. Do you know what I have realized these 3 days, sitting alone in this house that bears your name and not mine? I was a perfect wife, Rowan. I was patient when you were cold. I was faithful when faithfulness cost me my own pride. I learned your household, your tenants, your mother's recipes, your every quiet preference, and I gave you nothing but honesty in 6 years of marriage. The failure in this house was never mine to carry. It was only ever yours, and you tried at that ball to make it mine because carrying your own shame was more than your pride could bear." The room was silent but for the ticking of the great clock in the hall, a sound Isolde had listened to on 1,000 ordinary evenings, without ever once truly hearing it until now. "What do you want me to do?" Rowan asked at last, and there was something almost like fear beneath the exhaustion in his voice. "Tell me what you want, Isolde, and I will do it. End it with Odette. Send her from London entirely, if that is what will mend this." Isolde looked at him for a long moment. This man she had loved so completely, so quietly, for 6 patient years, and felt something inside her settle into a strange, sorrowful clarity. "I do not want you to end it with her for my sake," she said softly. "A love ended only to save appearances is not love ended at all, Rowan. It is simply love hidden more carefully. I have spent 6 years being loved carefully, quietly, out of duty and convenience, and I find, now that I've finally seen the truth of it, that I would rather be loved by no one at all than be loved that way again." News of the Duke and Duchess's estrangement spread through London with the particular speed reserved for scandals involving titles and beautiful women. But Isolde found, in the weeks that followed her conversation with Rowan, that she cared far less than she had expected to. She had feared once that losing his love would mean losing herself entirely, that the woman who existed only inside the shape of his approval would have nowhere left to stand once that approval was gone. Instead, she discovered something startling. She was still there. She had simply forgotten for 6 long years to look. She left Everholt Hall not in disgrace, but by her own quiet choice, taking rooms at a modest house in a pleasant square with Nan Pruitt at her side, refusing every offer of reconciliation Rowan sent through increasingly desperate letters. She did not ask him for wealth, nor for revenge, nor for public vindication. She asked only for time, and for the small, unfamiliar luxury of days that belonged entirely to herself. It was Cornelia Wraxham, the sharp-tongued widow who had, unbeknownst to Isolde, been quietly admiring her from the edges of London society for years, who appeared at her new door within the first week, carrying a bottle of good sherry and an expression that suggested she would not be turned away. "I have watched women survive worse men than yours," Cornelia said, settling herself into Isolde's small parlor as though she owned it. "But I've rarely watched one leave a ballroom with such magnificent composure. You are wasted sitting in this house feeling sorry for yourself, Your Grace. Come manage my charitable society instead. God knows the woman currently in charge of it cannot balance a ledger to save her own soul, and I hear you can recite your household accounts from memory." Isolde, who had spent 6 years managing a great estate's every quiet detail with no recognition beyond a husband's occasional distracted nod, found herself laughing. A real laugh, surprised out of her, the first in longer than she could remember. "I accept," she said, "on the condition that you stop calling me Your Grace. I find I'm tired of the title." "Then what shall I call you?" "Isolde," she said simply. "Just Isolde. I believe I've been waiting 6 years to hear my own name spoken without anything grand attached to it." The work suited her in a way she had not expected. Within months, she had reorganized Cornelia's charitable society into something efficient and genuinely useful, securing better terms from suppliers, tracking every shilling with the same careful attention she had once given her husband's tea preferences, funding a school for the daughters of tradesmen who would otherwise have had no education at all. She found, doing this work, a satisfaction that had nothing to do with anyone's approval, a quiet, steady pride that belonged entirely to her. Word of her efforts spread, slowly at first and then with gathering warmth, through the drawing rooms that had once whispered about the plain girl who had married above her station. Now they spoke of her differently. The Duchess, who had walked out of Lady Sutherfield's ball with such extraordinary grace, who had rebuilt herself from the wreckage of a broken marriage into something the whole city seemed unexpectedly to admire. The first weeks in the small house were not triumphant. Freedom arrived with practical inconveniences. The chimney smoked. The cook oversalted everything. Neighbors invented reasons to call and then stared at Isolde with disappointed curiosity when she failed to appear ruined. At night she woke expecting Everholt's clock and heard instead the wheels of carts in the square. She also discovered how thoroughly her days had been organized around Rowan. At breakfast she caught herself wondering whether his head ached. In shops she noticed the paper he preferred. When rain began, she imagined the old leak above his study window. Love did not vanish merely because self-respect had awakened. It remained in habits, and habits had to be unlearned patiently. Cornelia refused to let sorrow become Isolde's only occupation. The charitable society maintained 3 schools, a dispensary, and a home for widows, though its books suggested money disappeared into dinners and decorative committees. "Everyone wishes to be seen helping," Cornelia said. "Almost no one wishes to do the help." Isolde began with the ledgers. Within a fortnight, She found duplicate invoices, inflated coal charges, and a supplier who billed for blankets never delivered. She dismissed no one dramatically. She documented everything, renegotiated contracts, and moved funds from banquets to classrooms. The work brought her into contact with women unlike those of Everholt's drawing rooms. Widows who supported children by sewing until their eyesight failed. Girls dismissed from service after illness. Wives whose husbands' debts had swallowed their legal existence. Isolde never compared her pain to theirs. She simply recognized a shared truth. Dependence made cruelty powerful. She proposed a training school where women could learn bookkeeping, correspondence, and household management for wages. Several patrons objected that too much education would make women dissatisfied. Then perhaps dissatisfaction is evidence that the conditions deserve improvement, Isolde replied. The remark was repeated through London. Some called her dangerous. Donations increased. Her friendship with Cornelia deepened through argument. Cornelia believed mercy should carry teeth. Isolde preferred reform to humiliation. Together they became effective. One opened doors by force, the other ensured something useful stood behind them. Nan watched the transformation with guarded pleasure. "You laugh differently now," she observed one evening. "How did I laugh before?" As though asking whether the room permitted it. Isolde considered this. And now? Now the room must manage as best it can. There were still letters from Rowan. At first they contained apologies shaped like explanations. Isolde returned them unopened. Later the letters changed. He wrote without asking for an answer. He described the estate school continuing under the plan she had made, the repairs completed at the North Cottages, his mother's grudging admission that Isolde had always managed the winter fund better than anyone. He did not say these things entitled him to forgiveness. One letter contained only 3 lines. "I saw Mrs. Bell's youngest boy today. I knew his name because you wrote it beside the rent account. I should have known it without needing your handwriting." Isolde read that letter twice and kept it, though she did not reply. Her family adjusted slowly to the woman she was becoming. Sir Edmund wanted to protect her now with a fervor that sometimes felt like another form of control. Her mother worried about permanent separation. Her sisters envied her rooms, her work, and the scandalous liberty of choosing dinner at 9. "I thought being a duchess meant you could do anything," her youngest sister said. "So did I," Isolde answered. "It meant many people could ask anything of me." Her first public speech came by accident. Cornelia was meant to address the annual subscribers, but a sudden fever confined her to bed. 30 minutes before the meeting, a messenger delivered the news and a note containing only 6 words. "You know the figures. Make them care." Isolde stood behind the curtain of the assembly hall listening to 200 people settle into their seats. She had spoken before committees and across dinner tables, always from beside someone more visible. A lectern was different. A lectern admitted that the ideas belonged to the person standing behind it. Her hands were cold when she began. She abandoned Cornelia's prepared jokes and spoke instead about a widow named Mrs. Hart, whose daughter had learned accounts at the new school and found work with a shipping merchant. The daughter's wages had kept 3 younger children fed through winter. Isolde explained what the coal budget meant in loaves of bread, what a trained clerk could earn, and why charity that preserved dependence was less merciful than opportunity that ended it. The hall grew quiet. Not the predatory quiet of Larchmere, waiting for a woman to fail, but the attentive quiet of people discovering that familiar sums described unfamiliar lives. When Isolde finished, applause rose slowly and then filled the room. She did not smile until she saw Nan in the back row, crying without shame. A newspaper printed part of the speech the next morning. The writer called Isolde a duchess with a merchant's command of arithmetic and a reformer's inconvenient conscience. Rowan sent no congratulations. She was grateful. The achievement remained entirely hers. Later that week, however, a package arrived from Everholt. Inside was the agricultural report Isolde had discussed with Rowan during their courtship, newly bound because the old copy had begun to crumble. There was no letter, only a card. "I remembered that this mattered to you before I understood that things could matter simply because they mattered to you." Isolde placed the book on her shelf. She neither returned it nor treated it as an invitation. Healing, she was learning, did not require every gesture to become a decision. Some could be accepted for what they were, evidence that another person had finally learned a lesson she was no longer responsible for teaching. Her own lessons were less comfortable. She had to learn to refuse requests without inventing illness, to spend money on a dress because she liked the color, and to sit idle for an hour without converting rest into guilt. She had to learn that usefulness was not the price of being loved. On Sundays, she sometimes walked alone along the river and did nothing more consequential than watch boats pass. At first, the emptiness unnerved her. Gradually, it became peace. One afternoon, she encountered a former Everholt tenant in the street. The woman curtsied and thanked her for arranging medicine during a fever years before. Isolde began automatically to say that the Duke deserved the credit, then stopped. "I'm glad it helped," she said. The words were simple. They felt revolutionary. She had not stolen credit from Rowan. She had merely ceased giving away what was hers. That evening she wrote the sentence in her journal. "I did a good thing, and I am allowed to know it." Beneath it, after some thought, she added, "I survived a bad thing, and I need not make it beautiful to justify surviving." By spring, the Society's school opened. At the dedication, a girl of 14 presented Isolde with a copybook filled with careful columns of figures. "I mean to keep accounts for a business," the girl said. "Perhaps my own." Isolde felt a pride deeper than any compliment paid at a ball. Here was work whose value did not depend upon being invisible. That evening she returned home tired, ink-stained, and content. She placed Rowan's pearl in a small box with her mother's broken strand. Not as a relic of marriage, but as evidence that broken things could be gathered without being worn again. Rowan, meanwhile, found his own world narrowing in ways he had not anticipated. Odette Vane, once so certain of her claim on him, grew impatient with a man now publicly disgraced rather than merely privately unfaithful, and departed for the continent within the year, leaving behind only the wreckage of a reputation he had once guarded so carefully. His mother wrote him long, disapproving letters. His steward reported the estate's affairs sliding into disorder without the quiet, competent hand that had managed them so well for 6 unappreciated years. He began to understand, in the loneliest hours of his grand and empty house, precisely what he had thrown away, and precisely how little of value remained to fill the space where Isolde had once stood. Everholt did not collapse without Isolde. That would have allowed Rowan the comfort of calling her indispensable only in a practical sense. Instead, the estate continued, but badly enough to expose how much grace she had supplied. The steward brought questions Rowan had never heard because Isolde once answered them first. His mother complained that servants had become careless, when in fact they had become uncertain. Invitations were missed. A tenant widow waited 3 weeks for fuel. The village schoolmaster resigned after a promised repair failed to begin. Rowan's instinct was to demand greater efficiency. Then he found Isolde's old system, notebooks cross-referenced by estate, household, tenant, and date. Beside each name she had written details no official ledger required. Mrs. Pike's eldest son was deaf. Mr. Lyle paid late after harvest but never defaulted. The school roof leaked near the eastern wall. His mother's headaches worsened in rooms scented with lilies. He spent an entire night reading. The notebooks did not accuse him. Their restraint was worse. They revealed a parallel Everholt, one Isolde had maintained through attention while he congratulated himself on being its master. Rowan began making rounds of the estate. The first visits were awkward. Tenants bowed and waited for him to know why he had come. Often he did not. He learned to ask. He learned that listening without immediately offering judgment produced information no report contained. At the school, a child asked when the Duchess would return. Rowan answered, "I do not know." The honesty tasted unfamiliar. Odette returned briefly from France in early summer. She requested a meeting at a discreet townhouse. Rowan almost refused, then decided refusal without understanding would leave old illusions intact. She was as beautiful as ever, but beauty no longer rearranged the room. She spoke of the cruelty of gossip and the life they might still build abroad. When Rowan mentioned Isolde, Odette's impatience sharpened. "You cannot truly prefer that quiet little manager to what we were." "What were we?" The question surprised them both. Odette described youth, passion, promises made before duty intervened. Rowan remembered those things. He also remembered how their meetings after her return had been constructed from grievance. They had loved the tragedy of themselves. Isolde had loved the ordinary man who drank bitter tea, grieved an old dog, failed in pride, and needed to be better than he was. "I used my pain as permission," he said. Odette stared. "For what?" "To cause hers." He left before she finished answering. Repentance did not restore him. It stripped him of excuses and left work. He wrote apologies to Lady Sutherfield and to Isolde's parents. He publicly corrected a rumor that Isolde had abandoned him without cause, accepting the humiliation he once forced her to carry. Society enjoyed the confession for a week and then found another scandal. His mother was less easily satisfied. "You have always believed remorse is an emotion," the dowager told him. "It is a discipline. Feeling wretched is merely the beginning." Rowan asked whether Isolde had confided in her. "No, that is another failure you must bear. She protected you even from me." By autumn, Everholt functioned better. Rowan knew more names. He read every report. He funded the school and attended meetings that bored him because Isolde had once done so alone. None of it was performed as currency for her return. Slowly, he accepted that becoming worthy of forgiveness did not create an obligation to receive it. He continued writing. His letters grew less frequent and more honest. In one, he admitted that he had loved Isolde, but lazily. He had believed feeling was sufficient while conduct contradicted it. In another, he wrote that he no longer asked her to come home because he understood Everholt had never been fully hers. She answered only once, after nearly a year. "I am glad the school roof is repaired. Please ensure the western gutter is also replaced before winter." Rowan smiled when he read it, and then wept with his forehead against the desk. The note offered no hope. It offered something more difficult: acknowledgement without return. When the invitation to Larchmere arrived, he nearly declined. Then he saw Isolde's name listed among the honored guests. He understood that avoidance would be another form of cowardice. He accepted and spent the following week rehearsing nothing. For once, he would meet her without a speech designed to control the outcome. The ballroom remembered them, though rooms do not possess memory except through the people who enter carrying it. The same chandeliers burned above them. The same ivy wound around the alcove. The quartet played a waltz Isolde had heard the night she left, and for one breath the past rose so vividly that she felt silver silk against her skin. Then Cornelia murmured, "Lady Benton has worn enough feathers to migrate," and Isolde laughed. The memory loosened. This return was not a test of whether she could endure Rowan. She had already endured him. It was proof that no place belonged permanently to the worst thing that happened there. Guests approached throughout the evening to praise the society's work. A cabinet minister asked her advice on a proposed school fund. 2 young women requested introductions to the bookkeeping program. Lady Sutherfield embraced her with genuine warmth and whispered, "I have wanted to apologize for a year, though I still do not know precisely what for." "For owning a ballroom in which a man behaved badly?" Isolde asked. "You would be apologizing without end." When Rowan entered, conversation shifted almost imperceptibly. Isolde felt a tension move between them. A year earlier, such scrutiny might have dictated every breath. Now she found it tedious. He looked changed, not transformed into a hero by suffering, but worn into greater honesty. The arrogance in his posture had softened. He greeted those beneath his rank by name. When an elderly servant stumbled with a tray, Rowan steadied the man and waited until he recovered before moving on. Isolde noticed and disliked herself slightly for noticing. Cornelia followed her gaze. "He has improved." "Yes. Annoying, isn't it?" "Extremely." Improvement complicated anger, but did not rewrite history. Isolde could recognize the man he was becoming without volunteering to be the reward for it. Before he crossed the room, a young physician named Elias Harcourt asked Isolde to dance. He had assisted at the society's dispensary and possessed an earnest face, unfashionable spectacles, and no fear of intelligent women. Isolde accepted. The dance was pleasant. Elias did not hold her too tightly or treat conversation as an opportunity to display himself. He spoke of expanding the dispensary and asked her opinion because he genuinely wanted it. When the music ended, he thanked her and returned her to Cornelia. Rowan had watched. Jealousy crossed his face, brief and human. He mastered it before approaching. Their conversation began with courtesy and moved inevitably toward the past. When he said he would give everything for another chance, Isolde understood that part of him still imagined love through grand surrender. Once, such words might have conquered her. Now she knew that giving everything was easier for some men than practicing daily equality. She told him she forgave him. The truth of it surprised them both. Forgiveness had not arrived as warmth. It had arrived as the absence of an argument she no longer needed to win. Rowan knew what he had done. Society knew enough. Most importantly, Isolde knew. She no longer required his suffering to validate hers. When she said she was home, Rowan's eyes closed briefly. He did not plead again. "I understand," he said. "I think you do now." "I'm sorry it required losing you." "So am I." They stood together beneath the honey-colored light, no longer husband and wife in any meaningful sense, but two people who had once built something imperfect and real. Isolde allowed herself to remember its goodness without mistaking memory for instruction. Rowan bowed. "May I ask one thing?" "You may ask. Are you happy?" She looked across the room. Cornelia was arguing with a bishop. Elias was speaking to one of the school trustees. Lady Sutherfield's musicians began a livelier tune. Beyond the windows, the garden waited beneath stars. "Yes," Isolde said, "not every hour, but the life is mine, and that has made happiness possible." Rowan nodded. "Then I'm glad." This, more than his apologies, convinced her he had changed. He did not add that he wished to share it. Isolde left him and crossed toward her friends. People watched, but their attention no longer shaped the meaning of her steps. She had once walked this floor as an exit, each pace carrying her away from humiliation. Now she walked it simply because she had somewhere she wished to go. Later, near, midnight. She stood alone for a moment on the terrace. Cold air touched her face. Music and laughter spilled through the open doors behind her. Elias joined her, keeping a respectful distance. "Do you regret coming?" he asked. "No." "Do you regret leaving before?" Isolde considered the dark garden, the year behind her, the uncertain years ahead. "I regret that leaving became necessary," she said. "I do not regret that I was brave enough to do it." He did not offer consolation. He simply stood beside her, company that asked for nothing. The familiarity of that kindness might once have frightened her. Now she understood that a new life need not be built quickly, nor must every gentle man become a promise. She could allow a moment to be only a moment. When she returned to the ballroom, she did not look for Rowan. At the foot of the staircase, Lady Sutherfield's youngest daughter stopped her and said she wished to become like the Duchess who ran schools. Isolde knelt so they were eye to eye. "Become like yourself," she told the child, "but learn early that kindness and silence are not the same thing." At 1 in the morning, Isolde left Larchmere on Cornelia's arm. The carriage rolled through quiet streets toward the modest house in the square. On the seat between them lay plans for another school, 3 letters requiring answers, and a packet of sugared almonds Cornelia had stolen from the supper table. The life awaiting Isolde was not perfect. It contained work, loneliness, friendship, possible love, and choices no title could make for her. It was, for that reason, immeasurably better than perfection. Behind them, Larchmere's windows diminished into points of gold. Isolde did not turn to watch them disappear. A full year had passed by the time Isolde returned to Larchmere House, and she returned this time by her own choosing, invited not as a duke's wife, but as the woman who had transformed a failing charitable society into the most respected in London, a guest of honor rather than an ornament trailing behind someone else's name. She wore deep blue that evening instead of pale silver, a color she had chosen for herself, and she arrived on Cornelia's arm, laughing at some sharp remark her friend had made in the carriage, her whole bearing so different from the composed, careful stillness of a year before that several guests failed, at first glance, to recognize her at all. Rowan was there too. Of course he was. London's great houses were not so large that estranged husbands and wives could avoid one another forever. Standing near the same alcove where he had once hissed cruel words at her behind a column wound with ivy. He looked, Isolde thought, studying him from across the room with the strange, clean detachment of someone examining an old wound long since healed. Smaller than she remembered. Diminished. A man who had spent a year discovering that titles and grand houses meant very little once the person who had quietly made them feel like a home was gone. He crossed to her eventually, as she had known, somewhere beneath her composure, that he would. "Isolde," he said, and his voice carried none of its old command. "You look well." "I am well," she said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that it was entirely true. "How is Odette?" Something flickered across his face. Old shame, perhaps, or simple exhaustion. "Gone. To France, I believe. It seems I was never quite as irreplaceable to her as I once imagined myself to be." "I am sorry," Isolde said, and meant it, in the distant way one might mourn a stranger's misfortune. "Truly, Rowan, I do not say that to wound you. I hope you find someday whatever it is you were searching for when you threw away what we had built." "I know now what I was searching for," he said, low, urgent, stepping closer. "I was searching for it in the wrong place entirely. Isolde, I have written to you 12 times. I would give the estate, the title, everything for the chance to go back?" she asked gently. And there was no cruelty in the question, only a settled, quiet certainty. "I do not want to go back, Rowan. I spent 6 years being the person you needed me to be, patient and careful and quiet about my own unhappiness, and I have spent this last year discovering, at last, the person I actually am." She is not interested in returning to a house where she was loved carefully, out of duty, and betrayed just as carefully in return. "I forgive you." "Truly I do, because carrying anger for you any longer would only cost me more of myself, and I've decided I'm no longer willing to pay that price for any man. But forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. I am not coming home, my lord. I am home. I have simply built it somewhere you are not standing." She smiled at him then. Not the terrible, luminous smile that had emptied a ballroom a year before, but something softer, sadder, and entirely finally at peace. Then Isolde inclined her head, the small, precise courtesy of a woman who owed him nothing further, and turned to rejoin Cornelia across the golden light of the ballroom, leaving Rowan Ashworth, Duke of Everholt, standing alone once more beneath the very chandeliers where he had once told her she was supposed to be perfect, understanding too late that she always had been, and that he had simply never deserved the privilege of seeing it.